Hello, my name is Kristian Coates Ulrichsen, and I am an advisor at Gulf State Analytics and also a research fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston. And today I'm going to talk about a potential revival of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran and the international community, including the United States. As with a lot of Gulf states' approaches towards Iran going back really the entire period since 1979, there's no Gulf-wide GCC consensus towards Iran. And to some extent, approaches differ from Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, for example, where leadership view Iran's threat as an internal threat as well as an external one, through the potential, as they see it, the perception that Iran is meddling in their internal domestic politics. Whereas for countries like Oman and Qatar and in the UAE, especially in Dubai and some of the other Emirates, it's more of an external issue of regional policy. Individual states also have their own reasons for maintaining working relationships with Iran. In Kuwait's case, it's very pragmatic, trying not to take sides in regional politics. The same thing in Oman's case. In Oman also, because under Sultan Qaboos, Iran had sent under the Shah support for the Omani leadership during the 1970s Dhofar War, which was remembered by the Omani leadership. And Qatar shares the world's largest non-associated gas field with Iran, so they have a pragmatic interest in working together, at least on a working relationship. And in Dubai, there's been a long Dubai-Iran trade, which both licit and illicit has nevertheless been of importance, both to Iran, but also to the economy of Dubai. There's never been a kind of consensus on how to approach Iran at a regional level, or even within the UAE from a Abu Dhabi, Dubai perspective, at a national level either. And I think that's reflected in how these countries view a potential revival of the JCPOA, where Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, historically the more sort of diplomatic aligned states in the GCC, see the potential for a revival as a way to de-escalate regional tensions and to get along more productively with a neighboring state, which they still do acknowledge is not necessarily a friend in every way. Whereas for Saudi Arabia, for Bahrain, and for Abu Dhabi, it's much more of a hard-nosed geopolitical edge to a regional rivalry that they still see much more as a rivalry and less as an opportunity to work productively for regional stability. Saudi-Iranian diplomatic engagement has waxed and waned over the years. In the early 1990s, there was a period of gradual rapprochement after the Gulf War, after the liberation of Kuwait, but especially in 1997, after the election of Khatami as president of Iran, there was a period of reconciliation in Saudi-Iranian relationships. There was a security agreement in 2001, but then once Ahmadinejad was elected in 2005, relations went into a freeze again. We are now seeing, especially since 2019, a degree of limited Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, at least in terms of reaching out, in terms of establishing indirect and possibly discrete direct contacts. And we saw that beginning in 2019 after the attacks on energy and maritime facilities in Saudi Arabia, especially the attacks on Saudi Aramco at Abqaiq and the Khurais oil field in September 2019, and the lack of a real overt US response to those attacks, which shook Saudi leaders, including Mohammed bin Salman, who I think until that point had always assumed that where it came to Iran, the US and Saudi interests were one and the same, and Donald Trump's lack of an overt response signaled more to the Saudis that you're on your own, perhaps more than they cared to admit. And the maximum pressure campaign that the Saudis and the Emiratis had welcomed back in 2017, 2018 suddenly looked more of a danger to their interests once it became clear that Iran was pursuing a policy of maximum resistance and targeting regional interests, Saudi interests, Emirati interests, in ways that wouldn't touch upon direct attacks on US interests. And the Trump administration responded by drawing a distinction between those different sets of interests. And so we saw UAE and Iranian relationships beginning to sort of draw together in 2019 in a direct manner. And we saw Saudi-Iranian talks beginning indirectly in October 2019 and continuing, I think, into 2021, especially after the election of Joe Biden, and continuing mediated by people in third-party countries such as Iraq, in the acknowledgement for the next 3.5 years at least, until at least for the remainder of the Biden presidency, that there will be a diplomatic process and a desire perhaps by the US to disengage from the region, which means that those partners in the region will have to figure out ways to at least coexist, at least while there's greater certainty politically about where the US stands later on into the 2020s, and also about where the different parties themselves stand against each other. So for now, at least, there's a kind of cautious feeling of each other out, a sort of period of sussing each other's positions and gradually beginning to reach out after many years of not having done so. The thawing tensions between Riyadh and Tehran is likely to focus on issues specific to Saudi Arabia and Iran, at the most including Yemen, because that has become an issue in the Saudi-Iranian relationship as well, given the support from the Saudi side to the military intervention since 2015 and the support the Iranians have given financially and in terms of technology and missiles to the Houthi rebels. To the extent that there is a wider regional component, it's likely to focus on Yemen, partly because since the election of Joe Biden, the attacks from Yemen, from the Houthis using missiles and drones on Saudi targets, has intensified. And that brings together the two themes the Saudis have been concerned about with the JCPOA initially, that it focused too narrowly on one aspect of Iran's behavior with the nuclear file, but didn't focus on other issues such as the transfer of technology and missiles and Iran's support for regional proxy groups. Houthis are not necessarily a proxy of Iran, but they do receive technology transfers and have used that technology to target Saudi Arabia. So to some extent, Yemen brings the issues together and is likely to complicate any move to a post-JCPOA sort of 2.0 agreement on wider regional issues, at least while the different parties are still in a state of some uncertainty with the Iranian election, and from a Saudi point of view are still not quite sure how to disengage from Yemen in a way that secures Saudi interests and really kind of leaves the Houthis in a way that cannot continue to threaten the Saudi border and the Saudi population. So for that reason alone, I think the Saudi-Iranian dialogue is likely to try and focus on ways to boost confidence bilaterally, to de-escalate bilateral points of tension, and at most to focus on what they can do to try and move Yemen to a political process where perhaps the Iranians could put pressure on the Houthis, not necessarily telling the Houthis what to do, because the Houthis I don't think will accept being told what to do by Iran or by anybody else, but potentially by putting pressure on the Houthis to make it clear that if they continue the attacks on Saudi Arabia, they will be increasingly isolated. So at least a dialogue that would include Yemen, but not necessarily include wider regional issues such as, from a Saudi perspective, Syria, Lebanon, or Iraq, which really between 2011 and 2015 did prompt the Saudis to feel they were being encircled by Iran or by Iranian-aligned groups, and which to some extent in 2015 prompted the Saudis to decide to intervene militarily in Yemen to do something about it, because they felt that the Obama administration in the US wasn't going to do anything about it. They figured they would do it themselves. Now, of course, that hasn't panned out as was planned. So I think the talks will focus mainly on direct bilateral points of tension, and at most, at least in the first phase, on Yemen as well. Thank you for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. _Ulrichsen. And thank you for taking the time.